Hello, everyone. I'm Heather S., she, her pronouns, and tonight I'm going to talk about the history of slavery in San Diego and how it still affects us today. You heard that right, slavery. But it's not what we think of when we hear discussion of slavery in the United States. When we think of slavery in the United States, the first thing that comes to mind is most likely the Atlantic slave trade and chattel slavery. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines slavery as the practice or institution of holding people as chattel involuntarily and under threat of violence, or the state of a person who is forced, usually under threat of violence, to labor for the profit of another. Merriam-Webster defines chattel as an enslaved person held as the legal property of another. In 1930, the governing body of the International Labor Office met in Geneva and adopted the Forced Labor Convention, quote, to suppress the use of forced or compulsory labor in all its forms within the shortest possible period. The document defines forced labor as, quote, all work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty, and for which the said person has not offered himself voluntarily. Forced labor is de facto slavery. This is primarily what we will be focusing on during this presentation. California itself has a long, sordid history rife with slavery, but tonight we are going to zoom in on how it manifested and persists in San Diego. Let's take it back to 1769, before California was even a state, before San Diego was even San Diego, when the Franciscans arrived and created the first European settlement in Alta California. As opposed to the more southerly Baja or Lower California, Alta California or Upper California was a province of New Spain that later became a territory of Mexico before parts of it gained U.S. statehood as California. Alta California was divided into 4 military districts that each contained 3 types of settlements: religious settlements or missions, civilian settlements known as pueblos, and military fortifications called presidios. A presidio was established in each district to protect that district's missions and pueblo. The first to be built, San Diego's presidio, was established in 1769, following an earlier decree from the Spanish crown that ordered the Indians to be rounded up, baptized into Christianity, and their culture destroyed, just as had been done to the Mayans, Incans, and Aztecs in Latin America. As a side note to everyone here, I will be using the word Indians to refer to indigenous people. It was a societal norm for the colonizers during the time period we are covering here. Historians refer to the enslaved natives as mission Indians. Even the laws included the term Indians up until the mid-1900s, and I will be reading the text verbatim to stay true to their character and intent. Prior to 1907, the area we now call San Diego County contained portions of modern-day Riverside and Imperial counties and had an area of more than 16,000 square miles. That's larger than Connecticut and Massachusetts combined. In this region lived 5 distinct groups of Native Americans: the Luiseno, Cahuilla, Cupeño, and the northern Diegueño tribes in North County, and the more southerly Kumeyaay, sometimes referred to as Southern Diegueño. Though the tribes themselves referred to each other by location, for example, a band to the east was called the East People, the Spaniards named many Indian groups after the mission in their region. The tribes that were sent to Mission San Diego were called Diegueños. While some modern Diegueños identify with that name, we will refer to the general group of Kumeyaay as such in this presentation. Like all native peoples, the Kumeyaay had an intimate relationship with the environment. Mostly hunter-gatherers, Kumeyaay bands lived in seasonal camps located in mountainous or foothill areas in the summer and fall, and moved to lower elevations during the winter. Secondary campsites would be set up for the harvesting of plants. Sites were selected based on proximity to water sources and protection from extreme weather and potential ambushes. This afforded the Kumeyaay access to a wide range of food and resources. Spanish explorers first made contact with San Diego's native people in 1542. The Spanish were busy building missions in modern-day Mexico and left Alta California untouched until Father Junipero Serra, a Franciscan friar, arrived with Don Caspar de Portola, a Spanish captain, in 1769. Serra and de Portola founded the first Spanish colony in Alta California on July 1st. Serra then established the Mission San Diego de Alcalá on July 16th, 1769, the first of 21 missions to be built along the west coast of California. These missions were established to serve the Spanish colonists while converting the local natives from local godless savages into hard-working, disciplined Christians. The Spanish soldiers herded Indians to the sites of the missions, where the friars directed them to build the missions. The Indians were forbidden from ever leaving. In addition to building the missions, the Indians also performed all of the work in the missions as forced labor with no pay. While the mission Indians weren't literally worked to death like the slaves in the South, they did endure poor living conditions, inadequate nutrition, and frequent, often severe punishment for breaking the rules or struggling to adhere to the rigid regulation of the day by the padres. The Mission San Diego de Alcalá that exists today is the fourth reconstruction. This most recent reconstruction began in 1931 after the mission had deteriorated into a ruin since the Franciscans had stopped administering the church in 1834. Completed in 1774, the original wooden church was burned down a year later by an estimated 800 Indians from 9 villages in a rebellion to protest sexual assaults on the women and 6 years of Spanish rule. While there were rebellions against the missions across California since the beginning, active resistance was rare in San Diego. However, Serra had predicted this rebellion because, as he observed, some soldiers would catch Indian women to become prey for their unbridled lust. The Mission San Diego de Alcalá was reconstructed in 1777, but this time out of something stronger. After the rebellions, the Franciscans rebuilt the buildings with adobe and tile roofs. This is the origin of the signature California architectural style of red tiled stucco buildings that we still see today. By the end of the century, the mission system had already begun to decay. With less funding from the Spanish government and lack of mission priests, Indians deserted the missions and the buildings fell into disrepair. Between 1834 and 1836, the Mexican government secularized the missions. The properties were broken up and sold or given away to private citizens. Half of the land and herds were intended to be given to the Indians, but by 1846, private landowners called rancheros controlled most of the land and relied heavily on Indian labor. Bound to the rancho by peonage, the Indians were treated like slaves. In fact, their death rate was twice that of Southern slaves. In 1848, California was annexed by the U.S. following the Mexican-American War. San Diego incorporated as a city in March of 1850. Then, in April, California passed the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. Signed into law by California's first governor, Peter Hardeman Burnett, the legislation ostensibly provided for the protection of Indian land rights. In reality, native California Indians were displaced from their traditional lands from 1850 to 1865. At least one generation was separated from their families, languages, and cultures during this time. Yet the Indians had no legal recourse. They could not vote or even testify in court against their oppressors. While the treaty that ended the Mexican-American War provided guarantees for citizenship and political rights, the California legislature prevented Indians from participating in the government. The law also allowed for and guaranteed labor contracts that would bind Indians in servitude for years. Abuse and manipulation of this law led to widespread enslavement of California natives in the 1850s and 1860s. This was by design. In 1851, Governor Burnett commented that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. We're going to take a moment to step away from the Indians and focus on some federal laws that were being passed during this time that further implicate California as a slavery-friendly state. The chattel slavery of the South did make its way into Northern California during the gold rush, as enslavers relocated their slaves to search for gold. Some slaves did escape and found refuge in Southern California. Legally, though, enslavers had the upper hand. Of the 5 bills that made up the Compromise of 1850, one admitted California into the Union as a free state. An act for the admission of the state of California into the Union passed on September 9, 1850, making California the 31st state. Another bill in the package, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, was passed 9 days later. The original Constitution that went into effect in 1789 contained a clause guaranteeing the return of an escaped enslaved person from any territory in the United States to their enslaver. Under the original Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution, it wouldn't matter whether a slave escaped to a free state. They had no chance of being discharged from enslavement. In 1793, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. Penalties would be imposed on anyone who assisted an escaped slave. Local governments could now seize and return escapees to their owners in other states. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act amended the law to increase penalties for those who aided an alleged fugitive slave or who refused to enforce the law. It also made it much easier for enslavers to claim that an African American was an escaped enslaved person. In addition to the 1793 Act's denial of the right to a jury trial, the 1850 Act prohibited an alleged fugitive from testifying on their own behalf. Worse, a sworn statement claiming ownership was all that was required to trigger the arrest of an alleged fugitive slave. This resulted in increased kidnappings of free African Americans to be sold into enslavement. In 1852, California passed its own version of the Fugitive Slave Act, protecting enslavers who brought their enslaved into California prior to its statehood. President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves in the southern states as of January 1, 1863. The Fugitive Slave Acts were repealed on June 28, 1864. Meanwhile, this was also a traumatic time for San Diego's Indians. Disease and deprivation took their toll on tribes. During the latter half of the 1800s, the population of the Indian tribes of San Diego County declined from nearly 10,000 to about 1,500. Despite this decline, tribal members continued to be the primary supply of labor in the county's economy. Indians were banned from public schools in 1855 in California. Many were forced to attend government-sponsored boarding schools, particularly between 1890 and 1939. Where they were required to give up their traditional ways. Harsh punishment for speaking their own language in these boarding schools led many Indians to protect their children by not passing down their own customs and language. This resulted in a loss of traditions and history for many Native Californians during this time. While there is evidence of some effort to protect Indian land use rights in San Diego County until 1865, a San Diego grand jury report from 1852 recommended that numerous Indian villages be removed because they were an eyesore and, quote, the hiding place of idle and pilfering Indians. In 1865, Congress ratified the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery and involuntary servitude in every instance except as a punishment for those convicted of committing a crime. This exception paved the way for the beginning of the prison industrial complex, but we'll come back to that later. While Indians had the right to vote under Mexican rule, California never passed a law giving them that right. In 1870, Congress ratified the 15th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, affirming the right of all U.S. citizens to vote. Yet, most American Indians did not gain the right to vote for another 50 years. Between 1871 and 1877, a series of presidential executive orders created reservations for the Mission Indians in San Diego County. Another 5 reservations were created by executive order in the 1880s. In 1891, the Federal Act for the Relief of the Mission Indians in the state of California became law, creating reservations for all of the California Indians who had been forced off their lands. The act appointed the Smiley Commission to determine which lands would be set aside as Indian reservations. Most of the land set aside by the federal government as reservations was desert and mountainous. As a result of moving on to barren, dry land, most Southern California reservations were unable to support their populations. The Panama, California Exposition that was held in Balboa Park in 1915 and 1916 included a 5-acre display dubbed by the guests as Indian Village. It was designed to promote the cultures of Navajo, Hopi, Apache, and other tribes of the Southwest, but San Diego and California native cultures were not included. This memorial to Father Serra was created in 1914 and first displayed during the Panama, California Exposition of 1915. It was originally located outside of the rear of the Varied Industries and Food Products building, which was meant to be demolished after the exposition, but was repaired for decades instead. Deteriorating, the building was finally demolished in 1969. Modern day Casa del Prado is a modified reconstruction that was completed in 1971. The Serra Memorial was not replicated. After a long debate and struggle at the federal level, American Indians finally gained full birthright citizenship in 1924, when President Calvin Coolidge signed into law the Indian Citizenship Act. In 1937, California's Act for the Government and Protection of Indians was repealed, lifting the vagrancy law that allowed for their indentured servitude. In 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom signed an executive order formally apologizing to all California Native Americans for the many instances of violence, maltreatment, and neglect inflicted upon them by the state. As we've seen, the federally recognized Native tribes have been squeezed into small plots of undesirable land. 12 bands of the Kumeyaay Indian Nation remain today. Due to cuts in federal Native American welfare programs in the 1980s, tribes were forced to find other sources of revenue. Today, the Kumeyaay operate 6 casinos in San Diego County. While the Kumeyaay are active in local society as teachers, lawyers, business people, and the like, they maintain their cultural traditions to honor how their ancestors lived. It sounds like a long overdue ending to an unfortunate story of exploitation and maltreatment, right? Well, not quite. In 2023, slavery is still alive and well in San Diego. It just exists in different manifestations than the chattel slavery of the South or the forced labor and genocide of indigenous peoples in California that we looked at earlier. Today, we see exploitation and coercion of labor for profit in the forms of human trafficking and prison servitude. California is ranked highest among U.S. states for incidents of human trafficking, with the San Diego area ranking 3rd within the state. 2 subsets of human trafficking exist in San Diego today: labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Trafficking isn't the same as smuggling, though they can occur together. Smuggling involves transportation, while trafficking leverages deceit, force, or coercion to exploit another person for labor, sex, or both. The government has been working on legislation to rein in this problem. In 2000, the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act became the first federal law to prosecute human traffickers and protect trafficking victims. It is difficult to compile accurate statistics because victims are typically threatened with deportation, violence, or worse. Public awareness campaigns are one of the most effective ways to reduce human trafficking. Labor trafficking doesn't get as much attention in the media as sex trafficking, but it is rampant in San Diego County among unauthorized Spanish-speaking migrant workers. It is estimated that more than 30% of these workers are victims of labor trafficking, with 55 becoming victims of abusive labor practices or gross exploitations. Most often, labor trafficking victims are forced into domestic servitude or work in construction, restaurants, agriculture, massage parlors, or sweatshop factories with little to no pay. The sex trafficking trade in San Diego County is an estimated $800 million a year industry with somewhere between 3,400 and 8,100 victims per year. More than 100 gangs control about 85% of sex trafficking here. Identified by the FBI as one of the top 13 high-intensity child prostitution areas, San Diego's sex trafficking recruits are getting younger and younger. On average, victims are recruited into sex trafficking at age 16, with homeless and foster youth being at the greatest risk. Because minors under 18 cannot legally consent to sexual activity in California, Force or coercion isn't required for exploitation via commercial sex acts, prostitution, exotic dancing, or pornography to be considered sex trafficking. However, victims are commonly coerced by having a large portion of their earnings taken from them, being psychologically degraded and manipulated, and or through facilitated or forced drugging. In November 2012, voters in California passed Proposition 35, a controversial citizen initiative to ban human trafficking. Focusing primarily on sex trafficking, the Californians Against Sexual Exploitation Act, also known as the CASE Act, passed with more than 81% approval. It then became the most popular initiative since 1914 when the process began. The CASE Act aims to protect the rights of victims by treating them as victims, not criminals, increases the fines and prison terms of offenders, and mandates law enforcement training. In 2017, California passed legislation focusing on training school administrators and educators to recognize victims of sex trafficking and how to appropriately provide assistance. Known as California AB 1227, or the Human Trafficking Prevention Education and Training Act, this law provides for human trafficking prevention education in schools. It mandates that every student in grades 7 through 12 receive a comprehensive sexual health class, once in middle school and once in high school, that includes information on what human trafficking looks like, how to avoid it, and how to get assistance if you need it. California Senate Bill 14 became law in 2023. Sex trafficking of a minor is now included in the list of crimes that are defined as a serious felony under California law, which makes the crime a strike under the Three Strikes Law. The final type of slavery that we'll look at tonight is prison labor. As we saw earlier, the 13th Amendment contains an exception clause for involuntary servitude. In December 1934, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an executive order creating a wholly owned federal government corporation called Federal Prison Industries as a prison labor program for inmates. The company has been doing business as Unicor since 1977. In 1979, the passing of the Prison Industry Enhancement Certification Program allowed inmates to be privately employed. Federal law requires all physically abled inmates who are not a security risk or who have a health exception to work. The private sector now benefits from another profit-making machine, prisons. Prison laborers do not receive wage protections under the Fair Labor Standards Act or the ability to unionize under the National Labor Relations Act. In 2021, the wages for inmates ranged between 23 cents to $1.15 an hour, with deductions taken for taxes, victim restitution, program costs, and court-ordered financial obligations. In 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom signed Assembly Bill 32, which would phase out all private for-profit prisons in California by 2028, including federal immigration detention centers. In May 2023, a federal court ruled that AB 32 is unconstitutional, at least as it applies to private detention contracts for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and other federal agencies. For now, Newsom's plan to phase out non-federal private prisons in the state by 2028 is moving forward. California's Constitution, as written in 1849, originally stated that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, unless for the punishment of crime, shall ever be tolerated in this state. In 1974, it was revised to prohibit slavery in its entirety and involuntary servitude unless it's punishment for committing a crime. Considering that involuntary servitude is de facto slavery, slavery is still legally a burden for many in California. Currently, legislation is being advanced in California to remove involuntary servitude from the state constitution. If it passes in the California legislature by a 2/3 vote, voters will make the final decision next November. By the way, November is National American Indian Heritage Month. Let it serve as a reminder to learn more about the Kumeyaay and other local Native cultures, wherever you may be.
This concludes our DSA Night School session for November 2023. Thank you and have a great night.